What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of the most disappointing games I reviewed in 2023, specifically talking about new releases, which is important to mention because I also review older games quite often. Though right here at the beginning, some people might be wondering if it is a tad bit early to make a list like this for 2023, as we still have November and December left to go. But for me, there are 4 more new releases in the upcoming months that I plan on reviewing, and I have already played all 4 of those in some capacity via demos, early access periods, betas, etc. So I have a pretty good idea of what they're all about already. And while it is certainly not impossible for them to wind up being somehow substantially worse than I imagined, it's pretty unlikely given my hands-on experience with them. So, with that in mind, the last thing before we jump into these is while I do consider these games disappointing for one reason or another, that is not necessarily synonymous with bad. There's a couple of these games I do think are bad, and at least one of them I actually think was a great game, and the disappointment is more about the way in which it launched. So do keep that in mind as we move through these. To kick this video off, first up we have Forspoken. One of, I would say, 2 games that released this year. I don't think much of anyone would be surprised to find on a list like this. Forspoken was pretty poorly received at launch, and an interesting note about it is that while I didn't recommend Forspoken just like everyone else, the reasons for doing so were quite a bit different. If you remember the conversation about the release of this game, it was often centered around dialogue and how our protagonists acted in certain situations as they were pulled from a real-world situation into a fantasy realm. And a lot of people got really hung up on the way she talked about that experience. And while I think Forspoken has major flaws, that's not really one of them. I would say Forspoken's reason for being on this list for me, however, is more about how it dealt with its world. That is to say, you come into the world of Athia when it is in a pretty rough spot. There's basically one city left, people are struggling to just survive, their previous settlements and villages, etc. have all been abandoned thanks to this sort of creeping magical plague of sorts. And while you, thanks to plot armor, are of course immune to this, when you go to those places, you read about all these crazy events and everything that happened in light of this, but you never get to experience any of it, which makes the world itself feel very dead. This is because it's mostly just filled with enemies to fight, and the problem with fighting these enemies is that the combat isn't great either. In fact, I showed in my review, you could basically kill every single enemy in that game by just using the basic first magic attack that you get and moving around a little. It was just very, very bare bones. So they built this interesting world with all this interesting lore, but you don't get to experience any of it, outside of just shooting some minions around abandoned buildings. And that, to me, was the biggest disappointment of that game, because it did do a few things well, such as its parkour system. Running around the open world felt like a lot of fun. I appreciated the way it depicted homelessness, which is something I've experienced myself, though that was really only the very start of the game. So it wound up being a situation where the few things it did do well were simply vastly outweighed by the things it did very poorly, which is to say nothing of how poorly the game actually ran. Performance-wise, this one wasn't very up to par either. So, needless to say, a lot going on with Forspoken. Not something we're going to see a sequel to, as its studio got absorbed by Square Enix in the aftermath, so kind of just is what it is at this point. Though moving on to number 2, we then have Redfall. Again, another one I don't think anybody's surprised to see here. And while Redfall has gotten a little better over time, I recently did a video talking about some of the patches that they've implemented, which have brought the game up to an, I would say, okay state. It's not exactly going to blow you away or anything, but it's not bad at this point, but its launch was certainly disappointing. And this was because of, again, a variety of factors, not least of which was pretty atrocious enemy AI and pathing. A lot of big, scary enemies were just kind of easily defeated by walking around a car that they didn't seem to register anything of, and that rough AI paired with other problems, such as being able to sneak and utilize stealth being advertised but then barely implemented in the main game, with the only way to take an enemy down silently being to grab a weapon with a silencer that you just had to luck out and find in a looter shooter with no real guaranteed way to do so, was pretty frustrating. And again, they've addressed some of these things in patches, which has gotten it a little bit better. But even with those issues resolved, the game still kind of suffers from a lack of content. There's really only so much to go do, which means even if you do play it, you're probably going to burn through what's available pretty quickly. And because of those things, it was a game that was widely panned for, again, just a myriad of issues it had on launch. But I will say one good thing about Redfall is I really enjoyed the world and the art direction. They were going for something called stylized realism, which is why it looks just like a little bit off compared to something like just straight up realism. And that combined with just the way they handled setting up the city and surrounding area of the island of Redfall and the enemies patrolling it and all the little lore tidbits sprinkled around were something that I did really enjoy about that game. But ultimately, I don't think it's a game that's ever going to get its due, so to speak, thanks to its poor launch. Now that brings us to number 3 on this list, and this is Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Now this is an interesting one because I actually think the game is great. The issue and why it was disappointing is just the absolutely sorry state that this game released in, which resulted in massive problems across pretty much every range of hardware that made it almost unplayable. Because even in the best case scenario, where most of the game was fine and you weren't encountering too many issues, there were certain parts of the game for just about everyone that would crash repeatedly, one of which I personally got stuck on for a few hours while I tinkered with various settings to try to get me through this one cutscene that just crashed every single time. In my own review for this, I mentioned for a conclusion basically that I really enjoyed everything else the game was trying to do, but it was impossible to recommend because the chances of it running for you were pretty poor. So the disappointment here was simply that the game obviously wasn't ready to be released when it was, and I just simply don't believe that they weren't aware of that fact because of how widespread these performance issues were, which was a real shame because gameplay-wise, I loved it. It was a lot of fun. Seeing the continuation of the story of Cal Kestis, getting to do more with various lightsabers, and just explore some of that classic Star Wars fantasy is a lot of fun for me. That said, these days, towards the end of the year, you might have a little bit of better luck in this regard. They have released some patches and things, and I heard good things about the more recent patch in, I believe it was September. However, even in the wake of that patch, I still see people having issues running this game, so it's still definitely a bit hit or miss. But that brings us to number 4 on the list with Stray Blade, an interesting title that released back in, I believe it was April, and this game was attempting to bring a Souls-like to a slightly more vibrant and less gritty, so to speak, world, and unfortunately it just missed the mark a little bit. And while it certainly also had some bugs and performance issues here and there, none of those were as extreme as other releases, I would say, though I did run into some funny ones myself. My disappointment with this game was simply that the combat in particular just wasn't great, so much so that they wound up having to essentially rework the combat, which was done, I believe, back in June or July, with the initial system having enemies either like flash blue or red with attacks you had to dodge or parry perfectly, and that combined with fighting multiple enemies who do this stuff all in tandem, and that initial combat on launch just felt very awkward, honestly. So while the game had a really interesting weapon system with tons of variety and weapons that you could master and learn different combos and attack strings for, but even that system kind of was, again, just hampered by the actual combat itself, left a lot to be desired. Now, what I did like about this game was running around. It has a sort of Metroidvania style to its semi-open world nature, and that was a lot of fun. You would get various abilities to allow you to traverse and find secret boss-style enemies and just little things about the lore and what happened to this sort of Lost Valley area that you're in. But ultimately, looking at the whole of this game, it just felt very janky and unrefined with systems that didn't quite work. Though, again, to be fair, this game was reworked a bit with, I believe it was patch 1.7 to change the combat, which does make the game feel a little bit better, but it doesn't really resolve the issues around everything else, like the janky movement, the occasional bugs you'd run into. So all in all, it was definitely a bit of a letdown. Though that does bring us to our final entry on the list, and for me, I would definitely say probably one of the biggest letdowns of the year was actually the Lamplighters League, a very recent entry. This was a TRPG, which I was initially very drawn in by, and then this game was developed by Harebrained Schemes, the studio behind the Shadowrun trilogy and known for this type of combat. It was certainly looking promising for fans of the genre, which is a lot of what I cover here on the channel. So when I actually got my hands on the game and played it a little bit, I was disappointed to encounter some performance issues, I would say pretty run-of-the-mill XCOM style TRPG combat, and a character locked behind a day one DLC were frankly a bit off-putting. And it was also priced quite a bit higher than most other games in this genre would typically be, and that's just the game itself. It came to light shortly after this game released that its publisher, Paradox Interactive, was less than happy with the game, declaring it essentially a failure and a write-off. Less than a week after it had released, a couple months before it released, they laid off like 80% of Harebrained Schemes Studio, and is actually parting ways with them. They will be independent again come January. So the whole situation was a bit of a mess. And I hate to see that from a developer who has given us quite a few games that many people enjoyed. The Shadowrun trilogy for me personally, but other people have enjoyed BattleTech and things like that. So if the game being a little underwhelming wasn't bad enough, we now also have to wonder if Harebrained Schemes is going to be able to recover from that at all, which I really hate to see, which is why I would say it is my personal biggest disappointment of the year. And with that, we're pretty much going to wrap this video up. While normally this is the part I would tell you to tell me all about the games you've had similar experiences with in some way. Given the topic at hand here, what I would much rather hear about actually is games people are looking forward to in 2024. As this year is kind of wrapping up, like I said, I've only got 4 more or so that I have planned to review in terms of new releases, which means as someone who does this for a living, I'm already looking ahead to what 2024 has in store. And while the first few months look a little slow, I'd love to know what everyone is looking forward to, as that is another list you'll see before the year is out, I'm sure. So naturally, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.